Good afternoon. My name is Weronika Gawlińska-Grulikis. I represent the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation. I'm honored to welcome you at the meeting of the project Seeds of History 2.0 Fields of Knowledge, organized by the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation and the Polish-American Social Club in Las Vegas, that is the Polish Diaspora Organization. And today's event is entitled From the Kosciuszkos to the Halle's Army. This is a webinar with Professor Andrzej Chwalba. I would like to welcome our today's guests. Professor Andrzej Chwalba, Institute of History of the Jagiellonian University, an outstanding expert on the 19th and 20th centuries, especially in social, cultural, and political history, Polish-Russian relations, the history of Krakow, and the Jagiellonian University. He is the winner of the Janusz Kurtyka Award in its second edition of the competition of his book, The Great Polish War, 1914-1918. This book was translated into the English and German languages. And Mr. Paweł Kurtyka, the president of the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation. And the meeting shall be moderated by Mrs. Iwona Podzorski, the vice president of the Polish-American Social Club in Las Vegas, active social activist for the Polish community in Las Vegas, and founder of the Polish art group Sami Swoje, organizer of many cultural and educational events. Project Seeds of History 2.0, Knowledge of History, is financed by the Chancellery of the Prime Minister as part of the Polish Diaspora and Poles Abroad 2022 competition. Translation and publication of books by Professor Chwalba and by Dr. Markowski, as well as meetings promoting them, are being held as part of a project financed by the Ministry of Education and Science as part of the task internationalizing Polish historiography and increasing the visibility of the achievements of Polish scholars by expanding language accessibility and promoting the best books in 2019-2020. Blockpress.pl is a media partner of this project, and I would like to give the floor to Ms. Iwona Podzorska, the Deputy President of the Polish-American Social Club in Las Vegas. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased that the Polish Club in Las Vegas has had an opportunity to start cooperation with the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, and thus already in November, just after we started our work, we organized this meeting with Professor Andrzej Chwalba, and it coincides very well with the celebration of the anniversary of the regaining of independence by Poland. And so, Professor, thank you so much for finding time for us, despite a very busy schedule. Our organization, that is the Polish-American Social Club of Las Vegas, organizes cultural events within the framework of maintaining and developing Polish culture in Las Vegas and Nevada. But also we would like to support and promote scientific and educational events so as to bring the Polish diaspora and American community closer to the Polish history and literature. I think that this cooperation with the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation in a certain scope and to a certain degree will help us to attain our goals. I would like to avail of this opportunity to invite you to listen to the concert of the Polish string quartet, Polish Violin Duo, that is going to perform within the program Polish Music on Stage US edition on the 10th of December at 7:30 p.m. in West Charleston Library. And the concert is sponsored by the National Music and Dance Institute. So thank you very much again for a possibility of organizing this meeting. And after this brief introduction, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Janusz Kurtyka. Paweł Kurtyka, I apologize. Ladies and gentlemen, as the president of the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, I would like to thank you and to thank our partner, the Polish-American Social Club in Las Vegas, for taking part in this project, Seeds of History, that we are implementing in cooperation with the Chancellor of the Prime Minister and also with a number of other Polish diaspora organizations that have thus joined the network that we have been developing together for 2 years. This is a network of the Polish diaspora organizations that work not only in the US and Canada, but we have added more organizations that are based in Europe, that is in the UK, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And this is the geographical area where we are promoting the output of the Polish historians, and we are encouraging the Polish diaspora organizations to work with us and to disseminate different materials and to organize promotional meetings so as to talk about some selected topics of the Polish contemporary history and such networking organizations. And currently we have more than 20 Polish diaspora organizations in this network. This is something that reinforces the main message of organization. We believe that, in fact, the Polish diaspora is they are the ambassadors of the Polish character abroad, and thus this is how the Polish organizations are promoting the good name of our country and the Poles in the context of the host communities, and this is how they support the activities of the Republic of Poland and boost the image of the Republic of Poland so as to protect Poland against false historical information, so that many times are the result of ignorance. So we are expanding knowledge, we are expanding know-how about our past, and this is how we work not only with the Polish diaspora organizations, but this is how we also cooperate in a number of other countries, that is the US, Canada, UK, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So this is how we are making yet another step forward in the development of this network of links between the organizations. And we do hope that today's lecture by Professor Chwalba will be very interesting and inspiring for you, which I'm certain of, and undoubtedly this will give you information that will allow you to expand your knowledge about the past. And together, we have been working with Professor Chwalba for quite some time now. We have been working together for 2 years now, and those are very interesting lectures. And Professor, thank you very much for this long-term cooperation with us. And I do wish you a very interesting presentation. And just to make a proper introduction for this lecture, let's have a look at the promotional video material that promotes Professor Chwalba's book, The Great Polish War, 1914-1918, because he's the author of that book, and also he is the Janusz Kurtyka Award laureate, and therefore we decided to translate that book, and undoubtedly this is a good a background for our today's meeting, and therefore let us watch now.
In 1914, the great powers clashed and waged a war that shaped lives of generations. In the wake of the great conflict, some new nations emerged. Others recovered their long-lost independence. This book tells the story of a nation divided for over a century between 3 empires. A tale of heroism and defiance, of patriots who wanted to fly their own colors. Far from the trenches of Verdun and the rocky shores of Gallipoli, a different war was being waged. A war for independence and freedom. After over a century of oppression, Poland was to be free again. The People of Poland at War, 1914 to 1918, by Professor Andrzej Chwalba, available on Amazon.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Andrzej Chwalba. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I also would like to thank Madam President, who has opted for warm climate instead of the chilly East Coast. Not close to Vancouver, not in Maine, but Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, South California, warmer part of the US. So we envy you, because right now we have -6 degrees Celsius here in Kraków. So when the war broke out, the Great War, World War I, it started in summer, in August 1914. And at that time, it seemed that the war would end by the first weeks of January, and some thought that the war would be over by December, that before Christmas it will be all over. Some optimists were saying that even the war would be over by the end of November. But neither in December nor in January, in 1914, there wasn't much talk about the Polish cause. But more was being talked about the Polish cause after the breakout of the war than before it. And there wouldn't be the Kosciuszko's army, there wouldn't be later Halle's army. And most of the soldiers initially were the volunteers from the United States of America. Thus, the memory of the Polish Americans who crossed the Atlantic, and they had to address their emotions and weaknesses and family problems, and they still declared their will to take part in the war. So their attitude deserves recognition.
The memory continues also in the Polish diaspora centers and also here in Poland. Before the war broke out, before this coincidence that many generations of Poles prayed for, because let me just tell you that only a war could truly transform the European continent. Only a war could make it possible for Poles to regain their country, their sovereignty, their freedom. So let's talk about possible changes in the borders. It was then that only the powers discussed those things. So this Polish coffin was nailed forever, as it seemed. So at the end of the 19th century, when you read the letters and writings of Poles at the time, you can feel this deep pessimism. They feel that Poland will not be reborn. They felt it was impossible because there were three partitioning powers and they seemed too strong. But then, quite briefly, the situation changed. Two powerful blocs appeared. On one side, we had Russia, one of the partitioners, and France and England were its allies. In the other bloc, you had Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Let's look at the political, military, and economic potential of these two blocs. They were quite similar. And also, you had this war in the Balkans before 1914. The tension had been growing, and the Polish elites, mind you, I do not mean the Polish society at large, because the war was somewhere there, far away. People didn't even know where the Balkans were. But even then, you could see certain political differences. Some people favored The allies, that is Russia, France, and England, others wanted the Austro-Hungarians as well as Germans to win. There were tensions, those differences, and they're also visible in the US. You can look at the Polish parishes, Polish diaspora. So Sokół, it was an organization that was born in Czechia, in Central Europe, but then also in the Austro-Hungarian Galicia, in other towns and cities too, in Kraków among others, and in other partitions. In Germany too, you have a Polish branch of the Sokół organization. So Sokół's organization associates young people. Young people practice sports, gymnastics, but those young people are also formed because they undergo a certain formation. They believe that one day Poland will claim its place in Europe, in the world. These were young people, mostly men and teenagers, 16, 18-year-olds. They would practice in the summer and in winter, mostly in the US, but also in Canada. And yet they were divided. And that will be more visible during the Great War. So the war meant that Poles started organizing themselves slowly. First, the one that was headed by Józef Piłsudski, a great person. But also you had other politicians, National Democrats, that were anti-German and anti-Austrian. It was headed by Roman Dmowski, a great diplomat, as they will see quite soon, but also a great leader. At the time, people didn't know that. And then he also had conservative politicians in Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Lwów, from Kraków. They didn't believe that Poland would ever return. Even a war was not enough of an opportunity for them. They considered themselves to be realists, and they saw a different project, a different opportunities. They hoped that Austria and Germany will prevail and a new country will appear, Austro-Hungarian Poland, and a new part will be included in this country. It will be not in a fully independent state. It will be the third segment of a larger state, a larger country headed by the Habsburgs. Those realists believed that it was the maximum that Poles could hope for. And their vision turned out to be unrealistic. This concept was not appreciated by the Budapest and in Vienna. First and foremost, it was not appreciated in Berlin because it was the Germans that posted various conditions. They had their own vision of how to shape Central Europe. Now, in the year 1916, in the areas that was taken over by Germans, Austrians, on the 5th of November, a new state was created. It was called the Kingdom of Poland, Królewsko-Polskie. So something did appear. The legionnaires, the Polish independent formations, considered volunteers, were largely responsible for that. 3 brigades, great soldiers. They were very valiant. They were fighting for the Polish independence. Without their bravery, their fight, this act of the 5th of November would never have come to be. So the Regency Council, a government are set up. However, only the Austrians recognized that entity. After all, it was the occupation authorities, it was the Germans and the Austrians that had a say in what was happening there. And yet the Allies, England and France, are forced to encourage Tsar Nicholas II to promise something to Poles. And yet, the Polish, or rather the Russian authorities couldn't promise anything, or maybe they didn't want. At the most, they would discuss some kind of self-governance. This is the maximum that the Russians were ready for. So until the old regime fell, the English and the French didn't want to discuss the Polish independence because Russia was more important than the issues of a local nation. Mind you, there were over 20 million Poles at the time, so Poles were quite numerous, and yet when you compare them to the potential of the great powers, this Polish potential was nothing to write home about, basically, average at best. So here it is. The concept is there, it's laid out. You've got those realists from the Polish Galicia, and they are looking at the project that would consist of Austria-Hungary and Poland. They want the other party would like to pursue this concept of the Polish kingdom, the Kingdom of Poland, sponsored by the Germans. And finally, we have those who left Petersburg and left to London and Paris. And there they are trying to convince the British and the French to give Poles a voice. Say, please tell us that Poland has a right to exist independently. And Roman Dmowski and his associate never heard what they wanted to hear. By the way, there is no surprise there. Those French and British politicians had their own objectives because they were basically waging a war, and it was a deadly struggle with the Germans and Austrians. They didn't want to lose the trust of the Romanovs, of the Russian authorities. And now let's move to the other side of the pond. What is happening across the ocean? A great pianist, a great patriot starts to operate. An exceptional person, Ignacy Jan Paderewski. In the history of the US, only 2 Poles who operated in the US, or rather 2 Poles are considered iconic in the history of the US. Well, Kosciuszko and Puławski are a different story because they actually fought when the US was not an entity. They were fighting for the independence of America. But once the USA came to exist, you had those 2 people, Ignacy Jan Paderewski and Helena Modrzejewska, as Americans pronounce her name. Americans would buy her cosmetics. She was quite a modern businesswoman, you might say. She understood that she was quite popular. She had their own product line. People would dress a la Modrzejewska. And I looked at the best Boston and New York restaurants and those in Cleveland. Unfortunately, I know nothing about Las Vegas at the time. It was before her time. So in restaurant menus, You had dishes a la Modrzewska, named after her, and that proves that she became a part of the popular culture. And Ignacy Paderewski was the second important person. When he gave a concert in Carnegie Hall, thousands, well, 12,000 or so would be present. He was basically what rock stars are today. You could see people going manic, and both men and women, boys and girls, went crazy about him. And this is why he could actually speak to Americans. He would have a tour and he would make those patriotic speeches. He would do that before his concerts. And he had this clause in his contract. So before every single concert that he gave, he made sure that he would have the right to give a speech about Poland. Americans didn't know anything about Poland. They had no news. They knew hardly anything at all about Poland. So he would tell stories about Chopin, about Polish literature, about Mickiewicz, about Polish dreams. He spoke that there is this great nation. Maybe he exaggerated a bit, but you know, if needs must. So he would call on Americans to help those who are suffering back on the continent, because Poland was suffering. An important institution was set up around that time.
In Switzerland, there were a number of institutions that could be established, and there was an association that was helping the victims of the war, the Polish victims of the war. So poverty, disability, as the result of the war, high prices, the wounded people, and the sick people, because there were infectious diseases. All those people were helped. Also, people had their houses, towns, and cities burned down. So all of that called for, all that required help, and thus the head of that association was the Nobel Prize laureate, but his deputy is Ignacy Jan Paderewski. And in that committee, we have such great people as Maria Skłodowska-Curie, the double Nobel Prize winner. And she was very active. She was also promoting the independence of Poland, and she was traveling in her ambulance all around France. And in that committee, we have also Joseph Konrad Korzeniowski, Joseph Konrad Korzeniowski, although not so active, and the Polish author, but writing in the English language. And he established a certain trend of Conradism in literature. So those were big people. And around 1914, 1918, in that period of time, we had quite a number of such big figures who were attracting the attention of the many. It would be, if we were then to ask people then what is, for instance, today, if you ask about Poland and what Poland is associated with, many people would say Lewandowski, and some people say with John Paul II. But I apologize for this comparison, but Lewandowski today is the kind of a figure as Ignacy Jan Paderewski was back then. In 1916, in the United States of America, elections took place, and Woodrow Wilson was president, elected president, re-elected president, professor of law, really good expert on political history, international law, an outstanding specialist in European history, quite an outstanding scientist in Europe and in America, and he became a politician. He won first in 1912, but in 1916, he started collecting funds for the electoral fund. And Paderewski understood that very well. Paderewski understood what was happening, and so he got in touch with Colonel Edward Hauser, the associate of Woodrow Wilson, and Colonel was quite an important person, and a lot was written about him in the States and in Europe and in Poland. He was a close friend to Wilson and also a soon-to-be great and close friend to Paderewski. So what did Paderewski do? He earmarked big funds, major funds, to the Wilson's electoral fund. And that was bullseye. As they say, he actually bet on Wilson, and he did it well. Wilson won, and therefore, according to the American tradition, if you pay to support a candidate, if you pay a lot, and once, as Rollet, the Frenchman, who wrote a beautiful book, Histoire de la Pologne, that book was actually then subsequently published in the Polish language, and he is the Frenchman who started the American archives. So he found some materials that say that the sixth greatest financial contribution to the fund was made by Paderewski. He could afford that. Paderewski was earning a lot of money, and he was performing almost every single day. So he was playing a lot, working a lot. But what was he doing? He was playing for Poland, for the Polish cause. It may sound highbrow today, but that was actually what he was doing those days. And indeed, he was dedicating his music to Poland. And therefore, he contributed a lot. And if he did contribute a lot, then Americans owed something to Poland. And when the first meeting took place, and Wilson said to Paderewski, "I will pay back to you. You will be US ambassador to Paris. What do you say?" And Paderewski said, "I'm not interested. However, if you could do something for Poland, that would make a lot of sense." So he added a document under the title, "The United States of Poland." So the very title of the document was meant to say that future Poland would follow the Republican American idea of the American federalism, because the Republican idea and the idea of federalism is quite close to the Poles as well. So those two nations are very close to each other. Americans and Poles are close to each other. And this is how they started a series of nice meetings in the Oval Office as well. It's not a myth. It actually is true that Paderewski did play the grand piano there. Grand piano was transported there into the Oval Office, and he was playing Chopin's Mazurkas. But he was also talking about Sienkiewicz, because Wilson knew Sienkiewicz, he read his books. And it turns out that Wilson also had read Słowacki. So he wanted to know more. And so he asked Paderewski to tell more. Maybe, perhaps, I'm not sure, but perhaps when on the 22nd of January, President Wilson, the leader of the then neutral country, but the most powerful country in the world, as far as economy is concerned, he made an appeal to the Senate. So it's not the appeal to the Congress. It's not the same thing, because the famous appeal to the Congress was made a year later. But he spoke to the Senate first on the 22nd of January. And then he said that it would be great that after the war is finally over, it would be great to establish independent Poland. So he was the first politician, Wilson was the first politician in the world who said that Poland should be independent. Let us recollect, the Kingdom of Poland, German and Austrian territory, was meant to be part of the Union that was promoted by the Germans in 1915, 16, 16, and 18. So they wanted to create a number of countries based on the ruins of Russia, including Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Finland, Estonia, Latvia. So they thought of establishing a number of countries, but to be controlled by Berlin. So the Germans were thinking that those would be independent states, but they would not be sovereign states. They would still be controlled by Berlin. So it's not really independence, but then Wilson said, the time has come for independence. It's the time for independence. And now, Paderewski had that idea. Already he voiced that in January 1st, and then he spoke about it again in March 1917. He spoke of establishing in then still neutral United States of America, although America was already getting ready to join the war with the Allies. So he suggested to establish the Tadeusz Kosciuszko army. And for Americans, Kosciuszko is a big person. It's a great figure for the world and Poland. Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a joint hero for the two nations. Therefore, such patronage would be a patronage that Americans would understand. So Paderewski thought that it would be easier to convince the administration in Washington and President himself, that is, to convince Wilson and his associates to this idea, because he saw the army of 100,000 people. But Paderewski was not a politician. I mean, he was doing politics. It's not that he was taking delight in politics. He was an artist. And in his artistic way, he perceived the world somewhat idealistically. And he thought that it was doable. But since the very beginning, Americans wanted to stay neutral, and establishing the Kosciuszko army would mean that Paderewski would take us to war. This is what they thought. God forbid that neutral America at that time would have to take sides. And then in 1917, Americans joined the war in April. I'm not mentioning the reasons for that. The reasons might be known. After all, those reasons are presented in history books in the US, so I'm not delving into the reasons for America to join the war. But anyway, America joined the war. And again, Paderewski is back with his idea. Another meeting. Again, he speaks about Kosciuszko army. Again, he mentions the 100,000. And Americans say no, yet again. Why? Why do they say no? What was the reason? The reason was that if there is a Polish army, then other nations who also have ambitions to return to the map of Europe would also like to establish their own ethnic armies. The Czechs, the Irish, the Croats, the Serbs, and so on and so forth. Or maybe the Finns as well, because in fact, the Lithuanians, because the Lithuanians there was a large group of Lithuanians who settled in the northwest of the United States. So Americans said no. But as they say, patience crumbles the rocks. And after many a conversation and after a lot of pressure, Polish politicians in Paris joined in, and they agreed to recruit Poles in America, but they agreed not to recruit them to establish the Kosciuszko army, but to recruit the Poles from America to go to France. That's the idea. So we were in Europe, then we went to America, and now we're going back to Europe. So what is going on in Europe at that time? On the 15th of August, which is not a coincidence, because that is the Mother of Our Lady Mother of God holiday. There is the club is established in Paris, and it was joined by many politicians and together with Zamoyski. And that committee turned into the Polish unofficial political representation in the West. So that committee had very good, sound diplomatic background. And in autumn 1918, Poland was not yet there, but the National Committee, the Polish National Committee, was already recognized as a representation of the fighting Poles. The Polish president was recognized, and the French and the Americans agreed to take loans, bank loans, so as to finance the Polish army that was just formed, so as to help the Poles who were still in the country. And if the Western banks started giving loans, it means that the politicians had to agree that Poland would be formed, because banks obviously would not give the money away without a possibility of having the money back, because if there were no Poland, no money back. And those were big funds. And the National Committee in autumn 1918, Poland was not there yet, but they started issuing passports with the name, the Republic of Poland. Although that Poland that was established after the return of Piłsudski, it was not the Rzeczpospolita Polska, it was the Republic. Then there was this conflict between Dmowski and Piłsudski, but that's not the point today. So before the Polish National Committee was formed, Dmowski was speaking to the French government, and he wanted to create the Polish army, which was eventually established, but it was fully dependent on the French. And so where were the soldiers to come from? That was a problem, where to draft the soldiers from.
The thing is, Poles appeared in France in large numbers only in 20s. Before 1914, there were quite few of them, just a handful of thousand, those that consider themselves Polish, that is. There were around 1,000 Poles from the French army that were moved to the Polish army. Now, the French and the British, why did they say yes even? Be careful. There is this revolution that took place in Russia, the February Revolution. The Tsarist regime collapses. A new temporary government is formed. Neither the UK nor France have any obligations vis-a-vis Russia, because the old Russia disappeared. There is a new Russia. A history is to be written anew. We open a new chapter. So suddenly they agreed to Poland. Russians are not protesting. The embassy supports this initiative. Some Poles then will travel by sea to France. They will cross the ocean and ultimately get to France. This will be quite meaningful, because there is going to be a handful of thousands of people, but we need an army, and an army means tens of thousands of people. Now, why is an army so important? Musky quite rightly believed that at a peace conference, various nations' effort will be looked at, victorious nations' efforts. Those that had an asset, that is their own military, their own armies, their own soldiers fought and fell and were wounded, they have a right to expect a certain compensation. Powers need to take into account their interests. That's why this concept was tabled. And, Sikorski had a similar concept. We need our own armies so that the world remembers about us, so that we have certain assets, aces up our sleeve in the future political game. So it was understood that the Polish army is going to recruit from the Polish minority in America. So this Polish National Committee leave. Paderewski was active there, and they talked to the American administration. Finally, the Americans say yes, but there is one condition. Who can go to this army? Only those that the American army is not interested in for a number of reasons. So training camps are set up. We're talking about over 20,000 people from the Sokov organization. That's a huge number of potential soldiers. Thousands of people were trained in Canada before that, because before the US agreed to the creation of the Polish army, or to support the Polish army in France, Poles became quite impatient and would flee across the Canadian border. And Canada is in war with Austrians and Germans, so Canada would welcome Poles, and they would, Canadians that is, would train Poles, and they were the first ones that would be sent to Europe. So in December, 600 people, Poles, arrive at the French harbor of Bordeaux. They are welcomed by French bands that play God Save Poland and the Polish national anthem. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła. Poland has not perished yet. So quite a welcome. Those people joined various divisions, and by autumn 1918, there have been around 23,000 people who arrived there from the US, I mean volunteers. And Halle's army at the time is 28,000. So we are talking about a huge input that the Polish diaspora had there. Paderewski is still, well, upset because they hoped for 100,000 rather than 23,000. So they were quite disappointed. So they hoped for 100,000 because this traditionally was the army that Poland was supposed to have. This is something that was actually included in the documents in the late 18th century. So why that many? Poles were not sure who to bet on. In other words, there were divisions among Poles, and Paderewski's concept was actually being undermined by the followers of Piłsudski. People from Warsaw, from Poznań, they favored Paderewski's army that would fight Germans. However, those Poles who heard from the Polish Galicia, they believed something else. They thought it was a bad idea and the Polish Legion should be supported. Attempts were made to recruit the Polish legionnaires in the US. A few hundred Poles indeed were recruited in the US, and they ultimately reached the Polish legions. So Poles tended to undermine their own efforts, and that made it so hard to have an army that would be more numerous. And another point, many Poles at the time did not feel fully Polish. Many of them felt American. the links to Poland were rather weak, so it was not a good idea to count on them, and the conditions in American camps were better. And another thing, Poles were quite afraid because they thought if we are recruited and if we join the Polish army in France, they might not be able to return. Yes, the American Congress passed an act, and that act stipulated that Americans fighting alongside allies would have a right to return. But people were somewhat distrustful in this regard. Further on, people there were rather poor, really poor. I mean, the Polish diaspora. So the Polish support, financial support for the victims of war was not significant. Calculations were made, and there were around 4 million Polish Americans living there at the time. On average, each and every one of them would have paid 12 cents. A laborer at the time, a laborer in Chicago, a laborer in Cleveland or in Pittsburgh would make $30 to $40 a month. Now, an American volunteer's pay was $14, while soldiers in trenches would be paid out $20. So those amounts were not incredibly impressive, and they did not encourage people to move across the ocean. On the other hand, 23,000, that's quite a lot. Had it not been for them, there would be no army at all. So let's talk about late summer, early autumn. The only exceptional general found his way there, Józef Haller, the only legionnaire that would fight basically against everybody, Austrians, Germans, and Russians. Because the problem in France was that there was a major scarcity of Polish officers. French officers actually headed those soldiers, and suddenly Haller appears on stage. This army would be then, from then on, called Haller's army, because he would head those soldiers. He would lead them. Some people call them the Blue Army, an Allied army. In July, the French have their own celebration, and they have their own defilade at Champs-Élysées. And Haller's army will march there as an allied army. Poles had a right to independence. Poles had a right to have their own country, and then the British and the French would say that Poles truly need their own independence. It is President Wilson's famous 13th point when he addressed the Congress, and there he discussed the creation of independent sovereign Poland. So there is this myth of the Kosciuszko army on the one hand, and there was Haller army on the other, but the path was quite long and winding. So there are Americans who fought for independence of our country. And at this point, let me thank their descendants. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. Thank you, Professor. We are really happy with this subject and how you discussed that. We cannot wait to see the book, or rather books, because we will receive them. We do have a few questions from our listeners. One of them is as follows. So the Polish diaspora played an important role. Around $50 million would be collected by the Polish Americans. Translated to current dollars, US dollars, it would be $600 million, around 2 billion zlotys in today's money. And this is just the money. On top of that, you had quite a lot of volunteers. Those people had a certain, well, basically Poles in Poland were not happy to see them. They were not really friendly to them. This is quite a complex matter indeed. The Polish authorities were unable to meet certain expectations that those people had, that Halle's soldiers had. Mostly, I mean here, certain living conditions and social issues. So it is about the money. Poles paid very little. It was token money. This is the first side of the coin. The other side of the coin, Poland, the Republic of Poland, was in great need. It was an hour of need, and Poland rather was fighting for its own survival. Poland was fighting a number of wars, including a war against Soviet Russia. Now, let's talk about the budget of Poland. So basically, half of the country's budget was military spending. Half. Now it is what, over 2%. Poland was a ruined country at the time. 90% of the territory was destroyed. And you can read it in my book, The People of Poland at War. Civilians suffered quite a lot then.
So this amount of money was, for instance, collected by the Poles who re-immigrated in 1918, 1919, 1920, who returned, but also with loans extended by the Morgan Bank that were taken by the Polish government. And the Polish government took loans in 1919, 1920. So when Poland was formed, the financial support became, there was more financial support later on, but it was as it was during the war. So indeed, this attitude to the Halles people was so dramatic that when Sikorski called the Americans during World War II to join the Polish army in the UK or in the Middle East, the Americans were rather reticent because they were afraid that they would be left all alone, that they would not have any backup, and in the best, and that those who would, that the wounded, the people with disabilities, they would not be compensated, would not be taken care of, and the disease would not be compensated for, because that was the experience of 1919. But then the Hallers, the Hallers movement of the people, the movement of Hallers people out of Poland was not well received, because the war was going on with the Bolsheviks, and then they were saying goodbye. But they actually came to fight for independence. They actually joined the Blue Army, the Hallers army, to fight for independence. And when there was subsequent conflicts broke out, they considered that they had not to fight in further battles because their mission was completed. And there were many letters from the American families saying, "Come back, we're waiting for you. You have been out for 3 or 4 years, so high time to go back to America. Poland is already independent. So Poland can do without you. So go back to America, go back home. So that was the case with his people when in April and in May Haller returned together with his army to Poland. It was the size of 60,000. And there were, because the army was increased by the prisoners of war from France and Italy. And undoubtedly, there was, I do agree with this question that there was this issue with the attitude to Haller's people. Another question, let me translate. Were there any political consequences of the fact that repercussions for Poland for having initially fought allied with the Austrians? And did this cause conflict with the West in the interwar period? Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting question. And that is a very pertinent question asked many times. Already in 1916, Piłsudski, who was commanding the legions, he saw that neither Germans nor Austrians, but from the Kingdom of Poland, were capable of offering anything to Poland. And so he saw the course of the events of the war. It was clearly seen that the French army, supported by the others and by Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, plus backed by India, by the so-called Indian Army, the French Protectorate, all of that was working against the Austrians and Germans. By the end of the war, the Allied forces had the group of 30 countries, and the Axis had only 4 countries, because those two were joined by Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. So Piłsudski understood that. And he started provoking Germans in 1917. And he started criticizing them out loud. And Hans von Silbersteller, the general governor of Germany in Warsaw, took a decision that Kazimierz Sosnowski was to be interned, actually a very important person during World War II later on. And this is what saved Piłsudski. This is what saved the Polish Legion, because this is when the crisis started with the Polish Legion, because most of the legionaries refused to serve. However, there were other politicians, Polish politicians, who thought that they had to bet on Austrians until the very end. And in this dispute, Sikorski versus Piłsudski, Piłsudski was right. Sikorski thought that the Poles had to bet on the Austrians, but luckily, the Peace of Brest was made between the Ukrainian People's Republic in 1918 and the Axis, and the legions. And Ukraine then was benefited a lot at the expense of the future Polish interests. And so the legions raised the revolt, they hit the Austrians, they went against the Austrians, and they joined the other side. And then the rest was disarmed, interned, and also the Austrian public prosecutor was demanding capital punishment for them. Eventually did not end that dramatically. Nonetheless, the Austrian bet was lost. And apart from minor detachments, the Polish were not fighting on the Austrian side, luckily. And of course, it's a very important question. What if we had 20 to 30,000 legionaries, or the Polish armed forces in the numbers of the thousands on the Austrian side? But actually, the Poles did not want to join the Germans or the Austrians because they didn't want to serve the invaders, and they also thought that Germany was losing. That is why Paderewski and Moscow were very active, and they were friends with the Allies and hence also the recognition of the Polish National Committee. That was of utmost importance. And the Polish army was due to this recognition, and hence the presence of the Americans was a decisive factor. This is exactly what made us not to be defendants in 1919, as was the case with the Hungarians. We were together side by side with our allies. We were not defendants. We were co-deciding. And they, our allies, were co-deciding on the Versailles Peace Treaty after the war was over. Thank you very much. I have one more question, a brief one. And what was, could you repeat, please? I didn't understand the question. Could you repeat the question, please? I didn't hear it. Could you repeat the question, please? What was the attitude of the national minorities in Poland? Now I see, I understand. So what did the Polish minorities think about the Poles regaining independence? Well, the national minorities, let me just remind you who those were, because there was no Poland yet, so we cannot actually speak about Polish minorities because we were all minorities within the Austrian, German, and Russian states. So those peoples that were populating the territories of those three powers had their own interests. Some were speaking of autonomy, others were talking about self-government, and others were saying that they had to have independent states. Those were the ideas of Poles, Slovaks, Czechs, Ukrainians, some Belarusians, Lithuanians, Finns, but the Ukrainian elites, especially in Eastern Galicia, were very powerful. They had their own units and they had their own ambitions and they had their plans. And so Ukrainians wanted to establish their own state. Therefore, they were not going hand in glove with the Poles. And everyone thought of their own national idea only. And because everything was happening about the same territory, hence the conflicts, the Polish-Lithuanian conflict, hence the Polish-Belarusian conflict, and war against two Ukraines, the first war in 1919, and then again another war against, that was against Petluras, Ukraine, and then another war, that is the war in Western Ukraine, the Lviv war. So, undoubtedly, the national minorities in today's territory of Poland were not really interested. The Jews were neutral, so to speak, but the Jews were very much linked with the Polish culture. And there were many Jewish volunteers in the Polish army in 2020 when there was the volunteer army established by Harris, and 3% of the soldiers were Jews. There were also many Jews, many more than 3% in Piłsudski's legions, but those were milieus that were very much attached to the Polish culture, and the Hasidic Jews, the Orthodox, they lived in their own worlds, and politics was not their field of activity. Thank you very much. And the last question, if I may. What were the relations between the Polish officers who served in those different armies, that is in the Russian, Austrian, and German armies? Well, the Polish officers were loyal to their armies. That is the briefest answer. I mean, it could not be in any other way. I mean, why would a Russian officer go to the Austrian side, and why would an Austrian officer go to any other side? That would be an act of desertion, which was punishable by death. And any officer was taking an oath. So generally speaking, officers were very much linked, attached to their armies, to their states, and to their dynasties. And sometimes it was said that those were Polish-speaking Austrian generals or Russian generals, Polish-speaking Russian generals. There were no Prussian Polish-speaking generals, though. But the question But later on, in the Polish army, once independence was regained, what were the relations between the Polish officers later on? Now I understand, after 1918, well, integration of soldiers coming from different armies who were using different military rules, and they were trained in a different military culture. Those who were in the Russian army, those who were in the Prussian army, in the Austrian army, they were all shaped and molded as officers in a very different way, just like the Polish Legion officers. So the Polish army was also of a different format. Or for instance, we had officers and soldiers who came with Haller's army, and this is yet another army. How about the Wielkopolska army? I mean, there was a mishmash. So there are 6 different faces of armies, 3 invading companies, 1 legion, 1 Haller's army, and the Wielkopolska army. And all of them were trying to somehow to be on speaking terms with each other. But yes, there were hostilities. There were different military mentalities. For instance, Austrian officers were staff officers in the majority. The Polish officers in the Russian army were the frontline officers. Piłsudski didn't trust neither the Russians as the chief commander. He didn't trust neither the Russian nor Austrian officers, and therefore, as far as Kiev or Vilnius campaign, and later on the famous Battle of Warsaw, they were fought by officers from the Polish Legion, Śmigły and other officers, Legion officers, because he thought that those were the officers who were the personalities to trust, and others could not be trusted because it was difficult to talk to them.
Professor, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting lecture indeed. Hopefully, the books that we will receive will answer a number of questions that people have here. Thank you to you, Professor. Thank you for this meeting. Thank you to the Foundation. Thank you to Paweł Kurtyka, the Foundation's president, for our cooperation. And over to you, madam. May I ask a question to you, Madam President? How many are you? Namely, people who identify with Poland in Las Vegas, and temperature. I'll show you something in a second. Because, you know, this place is not something that brings to mind Poland necessarily. So the active members of the club there. Professor, 20 people have been following us online on top of the people that are in the room. So, crème de la crème. Thank you very much. I hope that we will continue our cooperation and we'll have an opportunity to listen to more interesting lectures. Thank you very much, and goodbye. Thank you very much for your participation in today's meeting. And I would like to invite you to another meeting organized under the Seeds of History project. It will take place in December on the 2nd. Rafał Kowalczyk will give a lecture, Artur Grodger, A Dream of Independence. Rotmeister Pilecki's club is the organizer. Follow our social media, Twitter, YouTube, and others. Thank you very much, and See you then.